On the evening of October 17th, 2013, I was sitting on a quiet park bench in downtown Los Angeles. The air had that soft kind of chill that arrives before winter, when the city lights shimmer like they're trying to hide something. People passed by, laughing, scrolling through phones, chasing somewhere to be, and among them a man stood apart. He wore a dark coat, his hair slightly undone by the wind, a paper cup of coffee in his hand. I didn't know who he was at first, not really. He didn't carry the aura of a movie star or the loudness of fame. He just looked human, a little tired, a little lost. But that man was Keanu Reeves. And that night, he would do something that would change my life, forever. He didn't say a word to me at first, just sat down beside me, the way strangers do when the world feels too heavy to carry alone. There was something quiet in his presence, an honesty that didn't need an introduction. I remember his first words clearly. He asked, "Are you okay?" Simple, bare, real. It was the kind of question most people ask without meaning it. But he meant it. You could feel it in the way his voice broke the silence, not with pity, but with presence. I told him I'd lost my job a week ago, that I hadn't called my family in months. That life felt like an unfinished script I didn't know how to complete anymore. He listened. Not like a celebrity, not like a stranger trying to escape awkwardness. He listened like someone who understood what it meant, to lose pieces of yourself along the way. Then he said something I'll never forget. Sometimes the most painful chapters come right before the one that saves you. For a moment, it felt like time stopped, like the noise of the city melted into the background and only his words remained. They didn't fix everything, but they cracked something open inside me. Hope, maybe, or courage. We sat there for almost an hour. He spoke about small things, books he liked, how he used to ride the subway just to watch people live their lives. There was no trace of Hollywood in him, just stillness, just truth. Then, without warning, he stood up, reached into his coat pocket, and placed something on the bench beside me. A folded piece of paper. He smiled, nodded once, and walked away. No cameras, no goodbye, no explanation. I opened it after he disappeared into the blur of streetlights. Inside was a note written in rough blue ink. Be kind to yourself. The world will follow. And taped beside it, 5 crisp $100 bills. For a long while, I just sat there staring at that note. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was the message. The grace in a gesture that no one would ever see. No press release. No viral video. Just a man being kind in silence. And he never spoke about it again. That night, something shifted in me. Not because I'd met a celebrity, but because I'd met someone real, someone who reminded me that goodness doesn't need an audience. Sometimes it just needs a quiet street, a stranger, and a cup of coffee cooling in the dark. But that wasn't the end of it. Because months later, something happened that made me realize that night wasn't just a coincidence, it was a turning point. A secret that connected us in ways I never could have imagined. And the truth of what Keanu did next would change not just my life, but his. It's strange how one small moment can linger in your life like a quiet echo. Days turned into weeks after that night in the park. And yet, I couldn't forget the look in his eyes. That still, unspoken calm that somehow made my chaos settle. I kept the note in my wallet, folded carefully, edges soft from the number of times I opened it. Be kind to yourself. The world will follow. At first, I didn't even know what it meant. I thought it was just something people said when they didn't know what else to say. But over time, it started to change how I looked at myself. Before that evening, I'd been someone who rushed through life. I woke up every morning with a clock already ticking in my head. Find work, fix my finances, make something of myself. I didn't notice the small things anymore. The warmth of the sun through my window, the sound of my neighbor's child laughing, the taste of coffee in the morning. Everything had become a blur of survival. But after meeting Keanu, things began to slow down, not in the world, but in me. I started walking to the park again, the same one where we met. Maybe part of me hoped he'd return, but another part simply needed to feel the stillness he'd left behind. I sat on that same bench almost every evening, watching people pass, faces lit by their phones, voices chasing deadlines. I started to notice how everyone looked the same kind of tired I used to feel. It was during one of those evenings that I saw an old man feeding pigeons near the fountain. His coat was worn, his hands shaking slightly as he scattered crumbs on the ground. For some reason, I found myself walking over, sitting beside him and offering half of my sandwich. He looked surprised at first, then smiled. "Not many people stop," he said softly. I shrugged. Not many people see, and in that moment, I realized kindness doesn't always travel in big gestures. Sometimes it starts as a ripple, carried from one heart to another. Maybe that's what Keanu meant. I began to rebuild my days differently. I found a job again, nothing glamorous, just a small cafe on the corner of 5th Street. The kind of place where people came for warmth more than caffeine. I learned their names, their routines, their little habits. I noticed the man who always ordered black coffee but never drank it all. The woman who came in at 7:15 every morning and sat by the window, staring at the street like she was waiting for someone. I found comfort in these tiny human details. And yet every night when I closed the cafe, I thought about Keanu, about that quiet night and how someone so famous could live with such simplicity. No entourage, no noise, no pretense. Just a man with kind eyes and a quiet truth. It made me curious. How does someone like that carry so much peace in a world built on chaos? One night, after closing up, I looked up his interviews online. Most of them were like I expected. Film promotions, late-night shows, the usual celebrity charm. But then I found something different. A small clip from a fan who'd met him years ago. No cameras, no event, just a random subway ride. He was sitting alone, reading a book. When a woman entered holding heavy bags, he immediately stood up and offered her his seat. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He didn't smile for validation. He just did it, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That small gesture hit me deeper than I expected, because it reminded me of that night. The same stillness, the same truth. After that, I started noticing a pattern. Every story I came across about him was the same: kindness, silence, humility. And yet he never talked about it himself. He never posted it, never built his image around it. That quiet kind of goodness began to change me. I started volunteering at a small shelter nearby. At first, I went once a week, just to hand out food or talk to people. But soon it became a part of my rhythm, a new kind of purpose. I wasn't fixing the world. I was just trying to pass on what had been given to me, a moment of humanity. Sometimes when I'd return home late, tired but content, I'd wonder if he even remembered me, if that night meant anything to him. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the beauty of kindness is that it doesn't need to be remembered, only continued. Months passed like this. My life wasn't perfect. I still struggled, still worried, still had nights where I felt small. But I was no longer hopeless. One morning, while preparing coffee at the cafe, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A man walked in, quiet, unassuming, wearing a dark jacket and a soft smile. His hair was a little longer now, his eyes hidden behind glasses. But I recognized him instantly. It was him. Keanu Reeves. He didn't seem to recognize me, at least not right away. He ordered a coffee, black, no sugar, and waited quietly by the counter. I tried to steady my hands as I poured, my heart thudding like I was standing between two timelines. The person I was before, and the one he helped me become. When I handed him the cup, he smiled politely, ready to move on. But something in me couldn't let him leave without saying it. "Thank you," I whispered. He paused. For what? For that night. In the park. He looked at me, and for a moment, the world went quiet again. His expression softened like he was searching his memory, trying to place me. Then he nodded slowly, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips. "I remember," he said gently. "You found your chapter, didn't you?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded, because somehow he already knew. He placed a tip on the counter, more than the coffee cost, and said, "Keep writing it." Then he turned and left, the bell above the door ringing softly as he disappeared into the morning light. I stood there for a long time after he left, holding the same cup he'd just touched, thinking about how full circle life could be, and yet something about his words lingered. Keep writing it. It felt like more than advice. It felt like a challenge, because I didn't know then. But that moment was the start of something much bigger, something that would lead me back to him in a way I never expected. After that morning, everything inside me began to shift again. It wasn't the kind of change you notice all at once. It was quieter, deeper, like the slow turning of a page. But with change always comes uncertainty. For weeks, I couldn't shake his words, "Keep writing it." They echoed in my head like a question I didn't know how to answer. What did he mean? What was I supposed to write? I went through my days as usual, opening the cafe, serving customers, smiling at familiar faces. But there was a restlessness growing in me, a feeling that something was unfinished. Kindness had rebuilt my life, yes, but maybe it wasn't meant to stop there. Maybe I was supposed to do something more with it. That thought scared me, because the truth was, I'd always been afraid to want more. I'd failed too many times, lost too much, and learned to settle for small safety. But after that second meeting with Keanu, I felt something stirring again, a sense that maybe I was meant to tell stories, to help others the way he unknowingly helped me. So, one night, I pulled out an old notebook from the drawer. Its pages were yellow, filled with unfinished ideas, fragments of a younger me who believed in things. I started writing about that night in the park, about the stranger who'd shown me kindness without asking for anything in return. At first, it was just for me, but the more I wrote, the more it became something else, a confession, a reflection, a reminder that people are capable of extraordinary quietness in a world that never stops shouting. I began to stay late at the cafe after closing, writing under the warm hum of the hanging lights. My words poured out like water from a place I didn't know was still alive inside me. Then one evening, my manager walked in unexpectedly. Her name was Elise, kind, sharp, always noticing what others didn't. She saw the notebook, asked what I was writing. I hesitated, but something made me hand it to her. She read silently for a few minutes, her eyes softening with every line. When she finally looked up, she said, "This isn't just writing. It's something people need to hear." Her words frightened me more than they encouraged me, because sharing it meant opening a door I'd kept locked for years. But that night I decided to try. A week later, I uploaded the story online, a simple blog post. No pictures, no names, just a title, "The Stranger on the Bench." I didn't expect much, maybe a few readers, maybe none at all. But by the next morning, the post had hundreds of comments. People wrote things like, "I needed this today. This made me believe in people again. This sounds like Keanu Reeves." And then the views exploded. Thousands, tens of thousands. My inbox filled with messages, strangers sharing their own moments of kindness, their own pain, their own longing to be seen. It was overwhelming, beautiful, terrifying. But with that attention came something I hadn't expected: scrutiny. Reporters reached out, asking for confirmation, asking for proof. They wanted names, dates, evidence. They wanted to know if it was really him. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because it wasn't about him. Not the actor, not the fame. It was about what he represented. But the world doesn't always understand silence. One morning, I arrived at the cafe to find two journalists waiting outside. They had cameras, microphones, and the kind of persistence that doesn't take no for an answer. They followed me inside, asking questions, crowding me. "Was it really Keanu Reeves? Do you still talk to him? Are you making this up for attention?" I tried to stay calm, to keep working, but their voices kept pushing. Finally, I said quietly, "He helped me when no one else did. That's all that matters." They didn't stop. The next day, my story was everywhere. Anonymous writer claims Keanu Reeves changed their life. Is the stranger on the bench story true? The internet's new obsession, the Keanu kindness mystery. At first, it was surreal. Then it became unbearable. The cafe got busier, not with customers, but with people wanting to see me, talk to me, take pictures. I became a character in my own story, trapped in the narrative I'd written. And the worst part? I hadn't heard a single word from him. I told myself it didn't matter, that he probably didn't even know about the story. But deep down, a part of me wondered if he felt betrayed, if he thought I'd turned something private into something public. One night after closing, I found myself back at that same bench where it all began. The park was quieter now, the trees older, the air cooler. I sat there and whispered to the night, "I'm sorry." I didn't know if he could hear me, but I said it anyway. Then a voice came from behind me. "You don't need to apologize for the truth." I turned. He was standing there again. Same calm presence, same quiet eyes. My heart stopped. He sat beside me just like before. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy but not cold. Then he said softly, "You didn't owe me silence. You owed yourself freedom." I didn't know what to say. My voice trembled when I finally spoke. "I didn't mean to make it a story. It just became one." He nodded. "That's what truth does. It finds its way out." I asked him if he was angry. He smiled faintly. "No, I'm just glad you're still kind." Something broke inside me then, not in pain, but in relief. Because for months, I'd been carrying guilt for turning his kindness into words. But he didn't see it that way. He saw it as a continuation. Before he left that night, he said something that would stay with me forever. "People forget that kindness can survive even when fame doesn't. Let them talk. You just keep living." And with that, he walked away once more, disappearing into the soft dark, leaving behind a silence that somehow healed everything it touched. But that wasn't the end. Because what happened next, the days that followed, would test everything I'd learned. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about truth, choices, and what it means to carry someone's story when the world refuses to let it stay quiet. The night he appeared again felt almost unreal. Like life had circled back to offer me a moment of closure, or maybe a test. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. "You didn't owe me silence. You owed yourself freedom." But the truth was, freedom had a cost. By then, the story had spread everywhere. Articles, videos, talk shows, all chasing their version of the truth. Some praised me for sharing something hopeful in a cynical world. Others called me a liar, a clout chaser, a dreamer who invented a fairy tale. And somewhere in that noise, I began to lose my own voice. The cafe wasn't peaceful anymore. Reporters camped outside. Influencers showed up pretending to buy coffee just to film their reactions. Even regular customers, the kind faces I'd come to know, started treating me differently. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a headline. Elise tried to protect me, but the pressure was too much. "You need to step away," she said one morning, her tone careful. "This isn't good for you anymore." She was right. I quit that day. For the first time in a long while, I found myself without a routine, without a place that grounded me. I stayed home, drawing the curtains, avoiding my phone. Every time I opened the internet, there was another wave of speculation, a new post dissecting my words, my motives, my face. People I didn't know claimed to have sources. Some said I fabricated everything. Others said Keanu and I were secretly connected. It was madness. And through it all, he stayed silent. That silence hurt more than anything else, because I'd begun to believe in his kindness, in his ability to see people beyond fame. But now I wondered, maybe I was just another stranger to him. Maybe that night meant nothing at all. The doubt grew heavy. I stopped writing. I stopped going outside. My world shrank to the size of my living room. One evening, Elise came by unannounced. She looked worried, maybe even scared for me. I hadn't answered her calls for days. She sat down across from me and said, "You can't hide from your own story. You started something bigger than you. Don't let it die in silence." I wanted to argue, but I didn't have the strength. All I said was, "I didn't want this." "I know," she said gently, "but maybe it wanted you." That night, after she left, I lay awake replaying every moment. The park, the note. The second meeting, the words he left me with. You just keep living. But how do you live when the truth you told becomes a storm you can't control? A week later, a letter arrived. No return address. Just my name, handwritten. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "You don't owe the world proof. You owe yourself peace." aka, no signature beyond that, just the initial. It could have been anyone, but I knew. It was him. I sat there holding the paper, tears blurring the ink. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen again. Not by the world, but by the one person whose silence had both hurt and healed me. Still, his message raised more questions than answers. Was this goodbye? Or was it something else? A quiet reminder that I needed to reclaim my story, not bury it. In the days that followed, I began walking again. Not to the park this time, but to nowhere in particular. Just walking. The movement felt like therapy, one foot after another. Through streets that didn't know my name, I started noticing life again. A mother helping her child cross the road. A busker singing softly to no one in particular. An old couple sharing an umbrella in the rain. All these little moments of kindness happening without witness, without applause. And I realized, maybe that's what he'd been trying to show me all along. That the beauty of goodness isn't in being seen. It's in existing quietly regardless. But the world I'd accidentally awakened wasn't ready to let me go. A few weeks later, a documentary producer reached out. They wanted to make a short film about my story, The Stranger on the Bench. They said it could inspire millions, that it could turn chaos into meaning. Part of me wanted to say no, to disappear completely. But another part, the part that still carried his note in my wallet, whispered, maybe this is how it was meant to be shared. So I agreed. We filmed small segments, me sitting at the bench, reading the letter, talking about how kindness had changed me. They promised to keep it simple, authentic. No sensationalism, just truth. But when the trailer came out, it wasn't what they promised. They'd edited it like a mystery. Dramatic music, headlines flashing. Photos of Keanu. It wasn't a story about kindness anymore. It was entertainment. And once again, my words were lost in translation. The backlash was immediate. Fans accused me of exploiting him. Others defended me, saying I was spreading hope. It turned into a war of opinions, none of which I wanted. That night, I deleted my blog. Every post, every word. I needed silence again. Not the kind the world gave, but the kind I found that night in the park. In the quiet that followed, I realized something painful. I had built my peace on a stranger's kindness, but I hadn't learned to build it on my own. And that's when the real fallout began, not from the world, but from within. Because somewhere along the way, I had lost the simplest truth of that night. He didn't save me. He reminded me I could save myself. And until I faced that, truly faced it, I'd keep living half a life, waiting for someone else's silence to give me permission to move on. The sun had barely risen when the quiet hum of the cafe filled the street again. The same place where their story had begun. Simple, unplanned, and entirely human. The young man, now months into his new job, walked past it every morning. Yet today felt different. Something in him wanted to stop. To sit in the same chair where Keanu once sat. The corner booth by the window where sunlight spilled like memory. He ordered coffee. Black like before. He stared at the empty chair opposite him and smiled faintly. It had been months since he'd seen him. Since that morning when his life quietly rerouted from despair toward something he could finally call peace. He often wondered if Keanu remembered him. If he even thought about that morning, the way he spoke, the way he listened. But then he realized that wasn't the point. Keanu didn't help to be remembered. He helped because it was who he was. That thought echoed through him like a quiet mantra. He sipped his coffee and thought about how small moments could shift everything. One conversation could tilt an entire life. That single act of kindness, a stranger noticing him when the world had turned away, had ignited something sacred in him. He started showing up for others, just as Keanu had for him. He began volunteering at a local youth center on weekends, listening to kids who felt invisible the way he once did. He didn't have the right words most times, but he had time, and that was enough. And somewhere in the quiet hours after work, he wrote letters to people he had wronged, not to reopen old wounds, but to let go. To forgive. To begin again. Across the city, Keanu sat in a modest trailer between shoots, a script on his lap but his mind elsewhere. He had no idea how his words that morning had rippled into another man's life. He didn't need to. He lived by a simple truth. The world doesn't always need to see kindness to feel its weight. He thought about his own past, the quiet griefs, the empty apartments, the long walks after losing those he loved. There were chapters of pain the world would never know, moments when fame couldn't protect him from loneliness. He learned that sometimes the most heroic thing one can do is to keep showing up despite the silence. That was his secret. His stillness was his power. As he gazed out at the morning light, he remembered his mother's words he had carried since boyhood. Kindness doesn't need an audience, Keanu. It just needs a moment. He smiled faintly. Somewhere out there, a stranger was still carrying that moment forward. Weeks later, fate would bring them into the same cafe once more. Keanu was in the neighborhood for an interview, dressed casually. A black jacket, old jeans, no entourage. The air was warm with the smell of roasted beans and chatter. As he walked in, the young man froze. It felt unreal, as if time had looped. He wanted to say thank you, to tell him what that morning had done, but the words tangled in his throat. Keanu looked up, and for a brief second, their eyes met. Recognition flickered, soft, almost imperceptible. Keanu smiled, that same gentle smile that said, "I see you." And then he nodded, subtle and calm, before turning toward the counter to order his drink. No words exchanged, no grand reunion, just a silent acknowledgement, a full-circle moment carried by gratitude and grace. The young man didn't follow. He didn't need to, because he finally understood. The impact of genuine kindness doesn't need repetition. It doesn't need witnesses or applause. It just needs to be lived. That night, the young man sat by his window thinking about the day. The city pulsed outside, full of strangers carrying untold stories. He realized everyone was walking around with battles unseen, hopes unspoken, wounds still healing. He whispered softly as if to himself. Maybe that's what it means to live, to keep being kind even when no one notices. And somewhere in another corner of the city, Keanu Reeves sat alone too, quietly sipping tea and reading a worn-out philosophy book. He closed it after a while, staring into space. His life, filled with quiet giving, wasn't about being remembered. It was about reminding others what humanity looked like, simple, selfless, sincere. He took a breath and smiled to himself. There was peace in knowing that some stories didn't need to be told. They just needed to be felt. In that stillness, between one man's gratitude and another's quiet grace, the world shifted just a little. Not because of fame or money or spotlight, but because two strangers met one morning and chose kindness when it mattered most. The world moved on as it always does. Seasons folded into one another, and both men returned to their quiet paths, one known to millions, the other known to almost no one. Yet both carried the same invisible light. For the young man, life was no longer a chase for recognition or success. It was something softer, a daily act of grace. He had learned that peace wasn't found in fixing the past, but in forgiving himself for it. He used to believe that change had to be dramatic, a grand event that proved redemption. But now he knew better. Change was quiet. Change was sitting with your pain long enough to understand it. Change was letting kindness stay, even when the world didn't. Some nights he'd walk home after volunteering, the streets empty and soft with fog. He'd look at strangers through the mist, tired faces, lost expressions, and think, everyone's just trying to survive their own story. And that thought made him gentler. It was Keanu's gift still echoing through him, not the man himself, but what he represented: stillness, humility, presence. For Keanu, the realization came differently. Fame was never his pursuit, only a byproduct of what he loved: storytelling. Yet behind every role, he was chasing something deeper: truth. The truth that people are fragile and magnificent all at once. He'd seen the industry's illusions. How easy it was to be admired and yet deeply misunderstood. He'd walked red carpets with cameras flashing, but the only moments that felt real were the ones far away from the noise. A quiet subway ride, a random chat with a stranger, a moment of silence under city lights. That was where life breathed. He remembered that morning at the cafe sometimes, but only as a whisper, a gentle reminder that the smallest gestures could outlast entire lifetimes. And when people called him humble, he didn't quite know how to respond. It wasn't humility to him. It was necessity, Because after everything he'd lost, his best friend, his partner, his child, he'd learned that grief and gratitude often speak the same language. He realized something profound. You don't have to heal completely to be kind. You just have to keep your heart open enough to notice when someone else is breaking. One evening, months after their second silent encounter, Keanu was leaving a film set. It was late, the air crisp. A small crowd had gathered outside the lot gates, holding posters, phones, and hope. He moved through them gently, stopping when he saw a boy, maybe 12 or 13, standing quietly. No phone, no poster. Just looking up at him, nervous but smiling. Keanu crouched down and asked softly, "You okay, kid?" The boy nodded, then said, "My mom says you helped her once. You talked to her in a cafe. Years ago." Keanu blinked, caught off guard. "Your mom?" The boy nodded again. "She said you told her that even small kindness can save someone. She tells me that a lot." Keanu smiled, his eyes softening. "She sounds wise. She says you reminded her to be brave." He didn't know what to say. For a moment, words failed him. All he could do was place a hand gently on the boy's shoulder and whisper, "Your mom's brave all on her own." Then he signed a small paper for him. Nothing grand, just a quiet memory. As he walked away, he felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, not nostalgia, something purer, peace. The kind that comes when you finally understand that kindness doesn't just end with you. It keeps walking. It keeps multiplying. Across town that same night, the young man, now a little older, a little steadier, tucked his son into bed. The child looked up and asked, "Dad, did you really meet Keanu Reeves?" He smiled softly. "Yeah, I did." "What did he say?" The man looked out the window for a moment, his voice quiet. He didn't say much, but what he did say changed everything. The boy tilted his head. "What did he say?" He smiled faintly. "He told me that even on your worst day, you still have something to give." The boy's eyes lit up and he whispered, "That's cool." And it was. It really was. Because in that moment, the man realized this was the circle completed. A kindness once given had found its way forward, passed down not through fame or fortune, but through quiet love. Keanu Reeves would never know that this small thread of compassion had stretched across years, touching people he'd never meet. He didn't need to. That was the beauty of it. Kindness doesn't need witnesses. It just needs to exist. And in a world that often rewards noise, Keanu's silence had become its own kind of music. A melody of humanity played softly enough that only those still listening could hear. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that carried no promise, just the steady hum of ordinary life. Keanu sat in a corner of a small bookshop, tucked away from the city noise, flipping through a worn poetry collection. He wasn't searching for anything particular. He rarely did. Sometimes he read just to listen to other people's souls. A familiar voice startled him, soft, hesitant, almost unsure. "Mr. Reeves?" He turned. And there she was, older now, her hair pulled back, eyes gentle but still holding that faint shimmer of gratitude. He couldn't quite forget. For a moment, time folded in on itself. The years between their meetings disappeared. She smiled nervously. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to say thank you." Keanu closed the book slowly, setting it aside. "You don't owe me that." "I do," she said quietly. "You were the first person who looked at me like I wasn't invisible." Her words hung in the air like mist, soft, weighty, impossible to ignore. He nodded, unsure how to respond. "You seem different now, peaceful." "I am," she said. "But it took me a while to understand why. I kept thinking it was what you said that helped me. But now I think it was how you said it, without judgment. Just presence. That kind of kindness changes people." There was silence, the kind that felt sacred, not empty. Keanu looked at her, really looked. The shadows under her eyes were lighter. Her hands, once trembling, now rested calmly on her bag. She had found herself again. And for the first time, he realized something that shook him deeply. It wasn't just that he'd helped her. She had helped him too. Because back then, he had been lost in his own silence, grieving, drifting, surviving the weight of his own losses. But that day in the cafe, when he had reached out, something within him had shifted. Without knowing, she had given him a reason to believe that even in pain, there was still purpose. The act that saved her life had also reminded him of his own. He smiled faintly. "You know, I don't really remember what I said that day." She smiled back. "That's the beautiful part. You didn't have to remember. You meant it." They talked for a while, not about fame or movies, but about small, real things: family, mornings, forgiveness. Before she left, she said something that would stay with him forever. Kindness is the only thing that doesn't die when people do. He didn't respond right away. He just nodded, eyes wet with something wordless, a quiet ache that somehow felt peaceful. As she walked out into the light, Keanu stayed behind, watching through the window as she disappeared into the crowd. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel proud, not of what he'd done, but of what kindness had done through him. Later that night, alone in his apartment, he brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city stretched out below him, glittering, alive, indifferent. He took a deep breath, feeling the stillness around him. He thought about all the faces he'd passed on sidewalks, all the stories he'd never know. He wondered how many people were carrying invisible grief, just like she once did. And he realized something. You never really know what moment might become someone else's turning point. A kind word, a small gesture, a moment of attention. That's all it takes sometimes to steer a life back toward light. He smiled faintly to himself. "Maybe that's enough," he whispered. "Maybe that's all any of us are meant to do. Leave the world a little softer than we found it." Across town, the woman sat with her son at the dinner table, telling him stories about small miracles, the kind that don't make the news but still matter. Her boy listened, wide-eyed, his world shaped by a belief that kindness was strength, not weakness. And in that simple act, a mother teaching her child about compassion, Keanu's quiet legacy lived on, without his name ever being spoken. Weeks later, while filming a scene on set, Keanu was supposed to deliver a line about redemption, but something about the words hit too close to home. He paused mid-take, staring at the ground. The director called, "Cut," but Keanu didn't move. After a long silence, he said softly, "Can we try that again?" This time when he spoke, the words weren't acting. They were truth. The pain behind his eyes wasn't scripted. The emotion wasn't performance. It was the quiet recognition that every person, no matter how broken, still has something to give. The set went silent. Even the crew felt it. That unspoken moment when art stops pretending and starts reflecting life. That night, he returned home and wrote a single line in his notebook. The same one he carried everywhere. The world doesn't need heroes. It needs humans who still care. He closed the notebook, feeling something release inside him, a quiet surrender, a long exhale. He didn't know where that woman was now. He didn't need to. What mattered was that their stories had crossed once, in a moment that neither fame nor time could erase. Sometimes, that's all the universe asks. One intersection of souls, one act of unseen grace. Years later, when an interviewer asked him, "What's the kindest thing you've ever done?" he smiled thoughtfully and said, "I don't know. But I hope it helped, and maybe that was the real turning point. Not for her. Not for him, but for everyone listening. Because that's the kind of kindness that lingers, the kind that asks for nothing, but leaves everything a little lighter." The air was cool that morning, a soft blue haze settling over. Los Angeles before the city woke. Keanu sat by his window, coffee in hand, watching light spill across the skyline. He didn't have a shoot that day. No appointments. No cameras. Just stillness. And for once, that was enough. He thought back to everything: the cafe, the woman, the small boy, the bookstore. Each memory floated through him like fragments of a dream. None of it had been planned. None of it needed to be. The beauty of kindness, he realized, was that it worked even when no one was watching. He'd spent most of his life trying not to let the world change his heart. Fame tried to do that. It wrapped you in noise and expectation, made you question whether goodness still mattered when everything around you was staged. But life had its own way of grounding him. Every stranger, every quiet conversation, every heartbreak. They had all been reminders. And now, sitting in that silence, he finally understood something he'd never quite been able to put into words. The moments that define us are rarely the ones people see. He thought of his own losses, the grief that had once buried him. Losing friends, losing love, losing the pieces of life that made it feel whole. For years, he'd carried those ghosts quietly, never speaking their names in interviews, never turning pain into headlines. But now he saw what all of it had taught him. Suffering, when carried with grace, doesn't make you bitter. It makes you kind. Because once you've been broken, you recognize the fractures in others. You start noticing the quiet ones, the ones who look okay but aren't, the ones who smile, but with tired eyes, the ones who need someone to simply see them. That was why he always stopped when someone reached out, not out of politeness, but empathy, because he remembered what it was like to be invisible in a crowd. The more he thought about that woman, the more he realized her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to something larger, a ripple that had moved through both their lives. She had reminded him that kindness wasn't a transaction. It was a connection, a thread between two souls that didn't need to last forever to matter. He wondered how many times he'd walked past someone who needed that same thread. How many opportunities for grace the world missed every single day because everyone was too busy to notice. And then he smiled softly to himself. Maybe it didn't matter how many times we missed it, only that we kept trying to see. That evening, he went out for a walk. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, the sky a slow burn of violet and gold. The city pulsed with quiet life, people heading home, laughter spilling from open cafe doors, headlights tracing stories through the dark. He stopped at a crosswalk and noticed an older man struggling to lift a bag of groceries. Without hesitation, Keanu stepped forward, helped him carry it across and shared a small smile. The man thanked him, eyes warm, and said, "You look familiar." Keanu just chuckled softly. "Maybe I just have one of those faces." It wasn't a lie, not really. In that moment, he didn't want to be Keanu Reeves, the actor. He wanted to be just another human being, someone who saw, someone who cared. And as he walked away, he realized that maybe the truest version of himself existed only in moments like that. Small, unnoticed, but real. Later that night, he sat down at his desk and opened his old notebook again. The one filled with fragments of thoughts, little truths collected over years. He turned to a blank page and wrote, "The world remembers fame. I remember faces." He paused, staring at the words, then continued, "You never know how deeply your quiet moments echo in someone else's life." He closed the notebook, exhaled, and felt something shift inside him. The need to do faded. The need to be seen dissolved. All that remained was the simple truth that being kind, truly kind, was enough. Somewhere across town, the woman sat by her window too. Her son, now a little older, was asleep. The city hummed softly in the distance. She sipped her tea and thought about that man she'd met all those years ago. She never told people his name. It felt sacred, like a secret meant to be carried quietly. But she did tell the story, about how a stranger once saw her when no one else did. How he reminded her that she still mattered. How one small moment of grace had rippled through her life, reshaping everything. And she hoped that maybe, by telling it, someone else might do the same for another lost soul. Because that's how kindness travels. Quietly, invisibly, endlessly. Back at his apartment, Keanu looked out at the city again, the lights glittering like constellations. He thought about how strange it was, how the world measured success by noise, when the truest beauty was found in silence. He whispered almost to himself, maybe that's the point. Because kindness doesn't need applause. It just needs to keep moving. And maybe the real realization wasn't about what he had done for others, but what others had done for him. Every connection, every moment of honesty, every shared silence. They had built him piece by piece, teaching him that even the smallest gestures were echoes of something divine. He smiled faintly, a tear catching in his eye. "We're all just trying to be good to each other," he murmured. And in that simple truth, he found peace. The weeks that followed brought a gentle rhythm back into the young man's life. No headlines, no viral posts, no reporters hovering outside the cafe. Just ordinary days filled with small, quiet victories, moments that felt monumental only because he noticed them. He returned to volunteering, not out of obligation, but because it nourished him. Listening to the kids at the community center, hearing their fears and dreams, he felt the same weight lift from his chest that had once crushed him. The same way Keanu's kindness had opened a door for him, he began opening doors for others. It wasn't always easy. There were mornings he wanted to stay in bed, evenings when he questioned whether his efforts mattered. But every time he saw a spark in someone else's eyes, the way a small act of attention could ignite hope, he remembered that silent bench in the park, the coffee in the cafe, the words that changed everything. Keanu, meanwhile, continued his own quiet life. He still walked the streets unnoticed in casual clothes, still held doors, still offered a soft word to strangers. He did not seek recognition. He simply understood that life's value often existed in unseen moments. He reflected on the countless people whose lives had intersected with his own in fleeting ways, realizing that none of them would ever know how much those encounters had shaped him. And perhaps that was the point. That genuine impact didn't require acknowledgement, only presence. One autumn afternoon, the young man found himself back at the park bench. The leaves were turning gold and red, swirling across the path in the crisp air. He sat, taking in the stillness, and for a moment allowed himself to remember the exact day his life changed. He pictured Keanu, calm, patient, attentive, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. But now gratitude was no longer passive. It had become action. He understood that kindness wasn't a one-time gift. It was a practice, a responsibility. So he began teaching it in small ways, mentoring younger employees at work, volunteering at shelters, speaking softly to those struggling with despair. Every effort was tiny, but together they formed a life that mattered, not to the world at large, but to those it touched directly. Months later at the bookstore, he noticed a small boy sitting quietly in a corner. His mother was nearby, distracted. The boy looked down, alone in his thoughts, just as he once had. He approached gently, kneeling to meet the child's gaze. "Hey there," he said softly. "You okay?" The boy nodded, unsure. "I'm just waiting," he smiled. Waiting is hard sometimes. But sometimes waiting means you're about to notice something wonderful. He sat with him for a while, listening to the boy's little fears and dreams. When it was time to leave, he left the boy with words that he hoped would ripple outward. Remember, even small acts of courage can change a life. And he walked away, leaving the boy with a quiet sense of possibility. In Los Angeles, Keanu finished filming a scene late at night. He returned home tired but content. He made tea, opened his notebook, and wrote a single line. Kindness matters more than memory. It was simple yet profound. A truth that had threaded through countless lives without fanfare. He knew he would never see all the lives he'd touched. And that was perfectly fine, because impact doesn't require attention. It only requires being present, being human, and choosing compassion over indifference. Later that night, the young man walked home, the city quiet around him. He passed the cafe, empty now, and smiled at the memories it held. He realized that life's most profound moments often passed quietly, in ordinary spaces unnoticed by the world. And yet, those moments had changed everything. The bench in the park, the coffee in the cafe, the words of a stranger, they were not lost. They had transformed into hope, courage, and a determination to carry the flame forward. He understood finally that life's true measure was not fame, recognition, or applause. It was the quiet, deliberate choice to be human to one another. And as he climbed the steps to his apartment, he whispered to himself, "Everything is enough. Everything I do is enough." And in that understanding, he found peace. The world continued its endless rhythm. But for both of them, the giver and the receiver of that singular, life-altering act of kindness, life felt full, meaningful, and whole. The city pulsed with life around him, unaware of the quiet transformations unfolding within its corners. Keanu sat at his favorite cafe once again, though this time he was merely a shadow among shadows, one of the many who moved through life unnoticed. He observed people, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. He saw their fatigue, their hidden worries, their fleeting joys. He realized something profound. The echoes of kindness never truly vanish. They travel silently, threading through lives in ways we rarely perceive. A single word, a gentle gesture, a patient ear, these things extend far beyond the moment, touching hearts that we may never know exist. The young man had written to him once, long after their initial encounter, describing how a small act of listening had shifted the trajectory of his life. Keanu smiled softly, thinking about the invisible ripples, how one quiet act could ripple outward, creating waves in ways neither giver nor receiver could fully understand. It struck him that life's true impact often lay not in spectacle, but in subtlety. In the spaces between headlines, in the brief moments when we chose humanity over indifference, these were the moments that lingered long after the noise of the world had faded. Across town, the young man reflected on the journey he had been through. He thought about how he once measured life by recognition, validation, and success. But all of that had changed. What mattered now was connection, empathy, and presence. He realized that true influence wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing others. He remembered the park bench, the cafe, the bookstore, and every small act that had reminded him that even in despair, hope could exist. The memory of Keanu's quiet kindness became a compass for his own life. He understood now that the simplest gestures carried more weight than grand declarations ever could. Life, he recognized, was a series of these moments, some small, some seemingly insignificant, yet all profoundly meaningful when lived with awareness. In the quiet of his apartment, Keanu reflected on his own journey. He thought about the countless faces he had passed without notice, the moments he had offered kindness quietly, without expectation. He understood now that the world often overlooked such moments, but their significance was not diminished. Kindness, he realized, was like a seed planted in invisible soil. It might not bloom immediately, and it might never be acknowledged. Yet it could grow in ways the planter could never imagine. He thought about the woman, the boy, the stranger, in the bookstore, each of them carrying pieces of his quiet act of compassion forward, extending it into their own worlds. And he smiled, knowing that the impact of a single act of humanity could multiply beyond comprehension. The young man often shared this lesson with others. In quiet moments, he would tell friends, coworkers, even strangers, "You never know how much a single act of kindness can matter. Sometimes just being present is enough to change someone's life." He didn't share the story for recognition or praise. He shared it because it was true, a reflection of the way life worked when we paid attention, and in teaching it, he found a deeper understanding of his own journey. He realized that gratitude was not merely a feeling, but a practice, an ongoing recognition of the connections that had shaped him and a commitment to continue that cycle. Keanu, too, carried his reflection quietly. He understood that life's greatest lessons were often found not in triumphs or accolades, but in subtle human interactions. These were the echoes that lingered, shaping lives long after the moment had passed. And so he continued, observing, listening, offering what he could. Not to be seen, not to be remembered, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The right thing to do, even when unnoticed, was always worth doing. The young man walked through the city streets one evening, watching the lights flicker and the shadows stretch. He realized that the world was filled with untold stories, moments of kindness yet to be noticed, and lives quietly in motion. And he understood that every choice, no matter how small, could contribute to a larger pattern of hope. Life, he thought, was not measured in fame or recognition, but in the quiet perseverance of goodness. He paused for a moment, taking in the sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of a child, the soft sigh of the wind, and felt a sense of profound peace. The echoes of one quiet act, carried across years and hearts, had become a force that would continue to shape the world in ways he could never fully see. And that, he realized, was enough. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, painting golden streaks across the room. Keanu sat quietly, a warm cup of tea in his hands, feeling the stillness settle around him. The city outside moved at its relentless pace. Yet inside, time seemed suspended, a rare moment of complete calm. He thought about the years, the people, the moments that had touched him, and how each of them had left an invisible mark. The woman in the cafe, the young boy in the bookstore, the strangers whose paths had crossed his own, all reminders that life's most profound truths often come without fanfare. He realized that his life story wasn't defined by roles or fame, but by the countless quiet acts that had passed unnoticed. These were the moments that mattered, the unseen gestures, the gentle words, the presence that asked nothing in return. Across the city, the young man paused on the same park bench where his life had subtly shifted months ago. The wind rustled the autumn leaves around him, carrying with it the soft laughter of children playing nearby. He breathed deeply, feeling grounded, present, and alive. He understood now that the impact of a single act of kindness could extend far beyond what the world acknowledged. A moment of care, a listening ear, a gesture of patience. These things shaped lives in ways that fame, money, or recognition never could. He smiled softly, reflecting on the ripples that had begun with a stranger who had once taken the time to notice him. That ripple had traveled far, touching countless lives in ways he might never know. And yet that was the beauty of it. It didn't need to be seen to be meaningful. Keanu and the young man would likely never meet again, yet in the quiet rhythm of their lives, each carried a piece of the other's humanity. A reminder that life's true richness lies not in what is recorded, posted, or broadcasted, but in the subtle, enduring echoes of care and presence. The young man, now living with intention and purpose, often told others, "You never know how far your actions can reach. Even the smallest kindness can change a life." It wasn't a story of fame or spectacle, but of the quiet power of humanity. And in sharing it, he ensured that the act that had once touched him would continue its journey, reaching hearts and inspiring goodness long after the initial moment had passed. Keanu, alone in his apartment, set down his cup of tea and gazed at the city below. He had spent decades navigating fame, grief, and solitude, learning along the way that life's value is measured in connection, not applause. And in that stillness, he felt peace. Peace in knowing that small gestures, unnoticed and unsung, could shape lives more profoundly than the brightest spotlight ever could. He whispered to himself quietly, "We are all capable of making a difference even if no one knows it." And with that, he let the city carry on below him, alive with its countless unseen stories, confident that somewhere, someone was living a life subtly altered by a moment of genuine kindness. As the day drew to a close, the young man tucked his son into bed. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, and asked, "Dad, do you think small acts really matter?" He smiled and kissed his forehead. "They matter more than you'll ever know. They can change lives, even if no one else sees it." The boy smiled, his imagination filled with hope and possibility. And in that small exchange, a quiet legacy continued, one act of kindness flowing into another, carrying its subtle strength forward. The world continued on, indifferent yet full of opportunity, and both men moved forward in their lives, quietly carrying the echoes of what had begun with a simple act of compassion. Because in the end, the true measure of life is not in recognition or reward, but in the hearts we touch along the way. The story comes to a close, but its echoes linger. Keanu Reeves never sought recognition for the quiet acts that shaped the lives of strangers. And yet, through simple presence, empathy, and small gestures, he left an invisible mark, one that traveled farther than any spotlight could reach. We don't often notice the ways our actions ripple outward. A kind word, a patient ear, a gentle smile. These are the moments that transform lives quietly, unseen but profoundly. Sometimes the greatest impact doesn't come with applause or headlines. It comes in moments of authenticity, humanity, and care. The young man, once lost in despair, carried that gift forward, teaching others what it means to see, to listen, to be present. Through his life, the ripple of Keanu's kindness continued, touching hearts and inspiring actions that would never make the news, and yet mattered all the same. And this is the heart of the lesson. We all have the capacity to change someone's life. It doesn't take fame, money, or power. It takes awareness, compassion, and the courage to act, even when no one is watching. Keanu's story reminds us that the quiet choices we make, the small acts of care we offer, often carry the greatest weight. Life is measured not in grand gestures, but in the human connections we nurture, the kindness we extend, and the love we share without expectation. So today, take a moment. Notice the people around you. Offer a hand, a kind word, or simply your presence. The world may never know what your act has done, but someone somewhere will carry its impact forward. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to TalksBerry and comment. Share a moment when someone's kindness changed your life. This story is dramatized for inspiration purposes only.